The ocean floor, having been the subject of a great deal of my childhood fantasies, did not at first strike me as an unusual setting in which to find myself. I presumed I was in the middle of some pleasant dream I would soon wake from. As time progressed, however, both the sharpness of my consciousness and solidarity of my surroundings became increasingly apparent. I was, evidently, standing on, or perhaps gently floating above, the sandy ocean bottom. I did not want for air, nor was my vision impeded very much within a certain radius. I was being conveyed, perhaps by a current, through the forest of craggy towers of blue rock. I craned to see the extent of their height, but they rose into the blackness out of sight. I heard nothing save the swish of salt water in my ears as I turned my head, and noted the absence of any form of sea life. Though I was not oppressed by the ocean's weight as one might expect at a depth so great, the dark expanse made me feel horribly alone. I am a potter by trade, with no apprentice or family, and I am accustomed to being at work without human contact for several days at a time. But even I would imagine many who lead far more solitary lives take comfort in knowing that I have neighbours, however distant they may be. Living a mile outside of a small town gives one a comfort that one lacks if he lives in the wilderness. Here my only sense of surroundings came from the rocks, and I took as much relief from their presence as rocks are able to provide. I floated on, never seeming to change direction, and my path never impeded by any obstacle. I could not think of how I came to be in this situation, nor why I was not at that moment drowning. No bubbles issued from my mouth and nose when I attempted to exhale, and I found I breathed quite normally. I preferred to see on my lips, however, for I could taste the salt all the same. The novelty of my predicament soon waned, and I wondered if I was being taken somewhere purposefully. I could not imagine a force capable of conveying me in the manner I was being so, save God himself, and I decided that if he was indeed behind it, he could certainly do whatever he pleased with me. I now believe that it was a little less than an hour from that time when I first saw the light ahead of me. The terrain became steeper and I more or less crawled up the incline, pushed along by the current or God or what have you, barely touching the ground with toes and fingertips. The light began as a yellow pinprick, like the beginning of a sunrise. It steadily increased in vibrance and intensity until I reached the lip of the cliff, at which point the force driving me forward ceased completely, and I gently settled on my stomach, peering down into an enormous crater and a wondrous scene. Where to begin? Dug into the centre of this immense crater were many hundred pits, deep, narrow holes, and from these rose, attached by long translucent tendrils, a host of creatures the likes of which I had never seen, nor even heard of in stories. Their slim spindle-shaped bodies were long, covered in a myriad of transparent tentacles that stirred the water around them, and extended up to a round head with globular eyes and a wide, thick-lipped mouth. These heads, too, were covered in a nimbus of smaller tendrils, closely resembling hair. The entire scene was almost blindingly bright, and from what I could see, these creatures were the source. None took notice of me, and all seemed to be looking intently skyward, or surfaceward as it were. It was deathly silent for some time, and it was this that allowed me to detect the instant the first of them began to sing. It seemed that the very centremost creature closed its eyes, tilted its head back, and issued forth a soft note, so gently that though the song had already started a good deal of time ago, and she was simply joining in as unobtrusively as possible. The note quickly grew in strength and volume, however, and soon her immediate neighbours started up, and then their neighbours, and the song rippled out to the edges of the crowd with great speed. As this happened, the light, which had been difficult to look at before, became nearly intolerable, and I was obliged to shut my eyes. I lay motionless for a length of time, eyes closed tight, yet far more attentive than I had ever been to any prior musical performance. I was transfixed and upset by the beautiful yet inhuman voices. The emotion being expressed by this fantastic chorus was, however, unmistakable joy, and in this notion I took solace. I could feel their joy blasting through their song, through me, and out into the dark sea in all directions. A creature that expressed its delight through song seemed, to me at least, to share something of the human condition. The longer I dwelt upon it, the less alien they seemed. I had by this time forced my eyes to adjust to the light, and I was able to see well enough provided I did not focus on any particular creature for more than a few moments. Their sizes varied greatly, and evidently by their size, their note. After some observation, it became apparent each creature was capable of only one musical note, and relied on its neighbours to sing when others were necessary. They coordinated a melody quite beautiful, and I found myself so caught up in the whole thing that I stood up on the lip of the crater, fists raised in the air, tensing triumphantly before them like a conductor at his orchestra. The memories of the events that followed are painful, but I must recount them nonetheless. Piercing through the chorus came a hideous shriek, in a voice that sounded as metal being scraped upon metal. The music died in an instant, and the light dimmed. The attention of all the singers turned to face upward and away from me. The scream came again. It was a scream and nothing else, for like the luminous creature's song, there was no mistaking the intent of the voice. It was not a scream of pain, nor anguish, nor sorrow, nor anything except hatred. It was a scream of an ancient, seething, concentrated rage having festered for centuries. The sound shook me to the core, and I fell back into my prone position. For a long time I saw nothing, partly because my hosts had greatly diminished the scene's brilliance by retracting into their pits up to their necks. Eventually I made out a great black form, blacker than the waters around it, hovering over the crater's edge opposite mine. The shape was wholly unfamiliar to me, and it was a few moments before I perceived that there were two separate entities in its formation. I have been fortunate to live in a time of complete peace, and had never before this point attempted to imagine the terror a lowly peasant might experience when mounted raiders charged upon his village to destroy his way of life and everything he values. I now believe that they, like myself in that instant, would be rooted to the spot with fear at the sight of a giant, black-helmed horror wielding a giant glaive atop an armoured beast of war. The intruder snapped his reins, and his great wail of a ride inched closer to the silent chorus. Time slowed down as the crowd and monster sat motionless and mute. I could hear the chinking of his armour and the creak of his fastenings as the mount treaded water. Then a poor, luckless, luminous creature began to rise from his pit and glow with great force once again. Wide-eyed, he stared at the armoured beast and hesitated for a moment, then tilted his head back, opened his mouth and began pouring out his note. The ear-splitting shriek came in an instant, and with a hideous swiftness the monster struck his blade and clove the unfortunate singer through his grounded stalk. In an instant his light died, and he floated upwards, transparent and ghostly. His faded corpse hung over the crowd for a moment before drifting off with the current. I wanted to shout and cry, to hurl rebukes at the monster, but I was paralysed with fright. In my mind I fervently urged all the remaining creatures to remain silent and still, but twice more members of the choir rose up to sing, and twice more they were cut down with a sickening snick and a shattering scream. After this, the creatures sunk lower, and the standstill resumed once again. In a while, the silence was broken again, this time by the monster himself. He began to laugh at the cowering crowd in deep gutted guffaws. His shoulders heaved and his head tilted back. His mount struggled to remain stationary under the jostling. Then, to my amazement, the creature closest to the monster raised himself to a tremendous height, far above that I had seen any yet achieve, and sang his note with terrific force. The monster reeled back at the sonic blast and nearly fell off his saddle. The rest of the crowd, however, seeing their adversary so disoriented, quickly followed suit and rose to join in the song. There were no more martyrs. The volume of light and sound far surpassed that I had previously seen, and I was once again forced to shield my eyes from the glare. I stood up and squinted from behind my shaking hands, however, and saw the monster struggling with his mount, which was frantically wriggling away from its rider. With one final heave it bucked him and shot away, leaving the armoured fiend to fall heavily into the ground inside the edge of the crater. Deprived of his means to escape, the warrior struggled to his feet and attempted to raise his glaive to make corpses once again. I could see his armour cracking and smoking, issuing a billowing black discharge from his armour joints and eye holes. He screamed again, the same metallic noise, but in true agony. He dropped his weapon and turned to claw at the wall of the crater, but it was too sheer and his armour too heavy. He clapped his hands to the side of his helm in a futile effort to shield his ears. The fissures of his armour groaned as they grew larger, and he dropped to his knees, burying his face between them. His armour bulged, then shattered and flung its tiny pieces in all directions. A tremendous cloud of oily smoke erupted from all sides of him and rose up into the darkness. When the water cleared, nothing remained behind. He was gone. The death of the tyrant did not seem to faze the chorus, and continued their songs as if they'd never been interrupted. Even when they sang in defiance of the monster, their message had not been one of revenge or righteous retribution. The emotion neither shifted nor diminished. It was always joy.